Welcome everyone. As I said, my name is Ella Saltmarshe. I'm the co-founder of the Long Time Project, and I am delighted to welcome you here today to this deep time session with Professor Marcia Bjornerud. The session's funded by EIT Climate Kick, and we're hosting it in partnership with the RSA and the Serpentine's General Ecology Network, which is supported by Outset Partner Grants. So before we dive in, some housekeeping points. So we've purposefully not done this as a webinar because we want to build community and the feeling of community around the theme of long-termism. But what that means is, unless you do something about it, you're probably going to be looking at a lot of people right now. So to get the most out of today, if you haven't already, I recommend you click on speaker view. And so that you're not overwhelmed by all of the people that are here. But having said that, it is amazing to see so many of you here. And the kind of demand for this event is perhaps reflective of the fact that right now, in this moment of crisis, many of us are looking for deeper perspectives on this moment. And that's certainly why we started the Long Time Project, because we think we need longer and deeper perspectives. And particularly, we feel that it's important to cultivate care for the world that will exist beyond our lifetimes, if we want there to be a world that exists way beyond our lifetimes. And I think that's particularly important for those of us on this call, for any of us who are adults right now, and will be adults for the next 20 years, because we are living in this kind of window where, as humans, we have a disproportionate amount of responsibility for the long-term future of this planet. The actions we take over the next couple of decades will impact the future of billions of lives, human and non-human. And so if we're going to handle this epic responsibility that we have, we need to develop longer time frames so that we take transformational change in the short term. And so to do that, we need to be more timeful. And that's why I'm delighted that we have Professor Marcia Bjornerud, author of Timefulness, here with us today. So Marcia is Professor of Geology and Environmental Studies at Lawrence University. Her research has focused on the physics of earthquakes and mountain building. She is a fellow of the Geological Society of America, and has been a Fulbright Senior Scholar at the University of Oslo and the University of Otago. But her kind of achievements aren't only in the academy, and she is doing a lot to bring geology and a geological mindset to the wider world. So she's written a book called Reading the Rocks, the Autobiography of the Earth, and of course the book that we are talking about today, which is Timefulness, How Thinking Like a Geologist Can Help Save the World. So the way that this is going to run is that Marcia is going to give us a deep dive into timefulness. Then she and I are going to have a conversation where we chew over some of the main themes. We're going to give you a bit of a chance to reflect on what you've heard and then come back together for a Q&A. And we are going to do all of that in an hour. So the long time in a short time. And so, yeah, it gives me no greater pleasure than to firstly thank Marcia. It is 7 a.m. with her. So we might be having lunch in the UK. She is definitely drinking some strong coffee. So thank you for being with us so early, and yeah, welcome.
It's a pleasure, Ella, and I applaud what the Long Time Project is doing. I think we're really in parallel ways, thinking in very much the same way. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. So I guess I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I came to this point as a geologist. As Ella said, I'm a structural geologist. I study mountain building, which takes some patience. It's a habit of geologists to look at ancient analogs and then look at the modern versions of those things. So even here in the Great Lakes region, I'm based in Wisconsin in the northern US, we don't you probably don't imagine that there are mountains here, but we have the deeply eroded roots of ancient mountain belts. And so we're quite accustomed to this zipping back and forth in time, and understanding that even things as majestic as mountains are really ephemeral features. But in my experience as a geologist over 30 some years, at least in the US, I find that people don't really understand what geology is. Either it's in people's imaginations about dinosaurs and dusty collections of rocks and minerals, or it's about rapacious extraction of oil and gas and mineral resources. And that's part of what geology is. But really, I think geology is a habit of mind. It's a worldview. It's a way of seeing the world in 4 dimensions. The habit of what I call polytemporal thinking, being able to hold in the mind's eye not just the world as it is today, but having a sense of the presence of the past, and by extension also imagining that the world is not going to be like this in the future. So it's this idea of time as a literal geographic dimension that we can in some way visit in our mind's eyes, and really I think feel the presence through rocks and landscapes. Another thing I think people may not appreciate about the geosciences is that they're as much philosophical as pragmatic, and I fully acknowledge that geology as a field that has been responsible for exploitation of fossil fuels is culpable for many of the serious environmental problems that we have. But it's also really a philosophical field. It's about deep origins. It's about how things came to be the way they are. It's about existential questions. And so that's the part of geology that I'm trying to bring to people who maybe have not had the opportunity to be exposed to it. I know here in the United States, in the high schools, there really just is not the same kind of representation of the earth sciences in any rigorous academic way that physics, chemistry, or biology are represented. I'm not sure if that's true in the UK and elsewhere. Geology is frankly considered sort of a soft science for the students who might not be university bound, and that's, everyone needs earth science background, but it sends the message that this is not a particularly challenging or rigorous or important field. And that's really unfortunate. So that means that we have earthlings who really are earth illiterate, and that's a big part of our problem. In teaching at the university level over the years, I found that probably the most challenging thing conceptually for students is grasping time, getting some sense of temporal proportion. How long ago did things happen? What was the duration of certain intervals in the past? And what are the rates of processes on Earth? And there's a huge range, orders of magnitude range of processes. We've perhaps in geology overemphasized how old the Earth is, and it is indeed old, and how slowly things happen. But that's really not the only message. And increasingly, we're trying to convince people that change can actually be quite quick. So getting some nuanced sense of the relative rates of change, how long things take, these are urgently important things. They're not just arcane academic abstractions. They're things that are absolutely essential to building a stable and resilient society. And it does strike me sometimes, it's a terrible irony in such a technologically advanced society that even very well-educated people are profoundly unaware of the way their planet works. I sometimes say we're like bad tourists on Earth. We're here for the duration of our lives, and yet we've never really bothered to learn the language or the culture of the Earth. And then we react with shock and indignation when something unexpected happens as a result of our ignorant behavior. The actual catalyst of the book, and when I look back, I think I had been thinking of a book about time for a long time, but it was 2016, a number of threads converged, and So let me describe what they were. First of all, locally here in Wisconsin, we were in the grip of a, well, I'll just say unenlightened state government. And one of the rulings by the state attorney general, we're the dairy state. We have lots of big dairy farms here. They're kind of sacred cows. And groundwater is something we're blessed with in abundance, but dairy farms take a lot of water. You have to give all those cows lots of water to produce all that milk. And recently the dairy farming has become scaled up to thousands and thousands of cows per farm. So each of these farms needs a very high capacity well to provide all the water for the cows. And there had been a series of these high capacity wells permitted. And finally, the State Department of Natural Resources in one area said, we can't permit any more of these wells because the net draw on the groundwater system is just too great. And the state attorney general stepped in and said, that's not fair. You permitted these other wells for these other companies. This company has the same right to that groundwater. And it was such a, it may not be fair, but this is the way the groundwater system works. We're going to deplete that aquifer in a matter of probably years, if a decade at most, if we don't look at the cumulative effects of the groundwater withdrawal. So that was it was such a wrong-headed idea that we could just opt out of natural laws and just think it doesn't apply to us. We don't want to pay attention to that. So that was a local example. Then in that fall of 2016, I was teaching a field course, a semester-long course in the Italian Apennines, in the Marche area. And I don't know if people remember, but there were a series of earthquakes that happened, one of which in August of 2016 devastated the little town of Amatrice. It was not a particularly huge earthquake. It was about 6.4, which is a moderate earthquake, but the town was absolutely devastated. And then in subsequent days and weeks, there were a series of other earthquakes that did continuing damage. And it struck us, I mean, it was both an interesting teaching moment, but also a very human experience of the still in progress nature of the earth. But it struck us that Italy is built because of tectonic processes, and there have been thousands and thousands of earthquakes and hundreds in the last century, and yet this is a country that doesn't seem to be interested in preparing for the next one. And then, of course, in the fall of 2016 was the US election, which was another kind of seismic event for many of us. And the aftermath of that, the reversal of the incremental progress that we'd begun to make on reversing climate change and other environmental initiatives completely derailed. And finally, at the same time, there was increasing talk of the idea that we might be able to colonize Mars. And as someone who studies the long-term history of the Earth, this kind of thing being actually taken seriously, gaining traction among the upper echelons of the super wealthy, just, I felt like, okay, I need to say something as a geologist about getting a grip on how long things take, how the Earth as we know it came to be, and what are the limits of technology essentially to change natural systems. So all of those things converged on and came together for me, and Timefulness is the outcome of that. And it's an attempt in a short book, and I hope an accessible one, to convey to interested but non-specialist readers the way geologists think and how that worldview can perhaps begin the cultural shift that we need toward long-term thinking. So that's a little bit about how the book came to be and where I come from as a geoscientist.
Great, thanks, Marcia. Well, let's dive into some of the content of the book. And perhaps let's start with this idea of time denial, as a theme that's come up in the introduction, and you write about it in the book. And so it'd be great if you could talk a bit more about time denial, perhaps about why you think we are in such denial, and the different ways you see that manifest.
Yeah, and I call it chronophobia too. And there are many reasons. It's such an entangled thing. There are personal reasons that are very understandable. We're vain. We don't like to think of ourselves as growing old and feeble. We fear mortality, our own deaths, the loss of loved ones. And those are natural things, of course. There are also, especially in this country, some religious groups that are in denial about the age of the earth, the young earthers and creationists. And from the outset, geology has always had to contend with these groups. And then on the other end of things, there are the apocalypticists who think the world's going to end any time, who have this foreshortened geologic future. But those are, in some ways, at least these groups are completely forthright about their time denial. They're not hiding it, or they're not denying it, or they're not blind to it. I think more sinister are the baked in societal and economic and political types of time denial. Certainly, again, in the United States, our political system is yoked to the 2-year congressional election cycle. There's very little incentive for any politicians to be proposing ideas that would have lifespans much longer than that. They've always got to be looking over their shoulders for the next election. Likewise, most corporations, especially in this country, are looking at their annual reports rather than any kinds of long-term investments. Our tax structures, all of the incentives, political and economic, are really rewarding the people who are making decisions over the short term. So those are fundamental infrastructural things, and I know that the long-term time project is beginning to chip away at those. Those are kind of outside my realm as a geologist. I'm aware of them and they're frustrating, but we need people in the political and economic systems to start thinking of how we can realign the incentives with long-term thinking. In science, though, I think it's fascinating. There is also a kind of largely subconscious time denial. There's a hierarchy in the sciences. I don't know if people sense this if you're not in the sciences, but certainly physics is at the apex. The sort of high priests of science tend to be physicists. And then we have chemists, and then maybe biologists, and then the lower rungs are the geoscientists, because we deal with all these really messy, imprecise things. And if you think about it, it's related to their relationship with time. Physics and chemistry, astrophysics would be an exception, but pure physics and chemistry are really timeless. They're about universal things. Atoms and electrons don't really have histories. They're existing somewhere outside time. And so they're kind of a Platonic ideal. Then you can be very precise because they don't have complicated evolutionary stories behind them. And so we privilege these very precise, timeless fields that are, in a broad sense, Newtonian. Of course, quantum physics is not Newtonian, but let's call that the Newtonian mindset over the sciences like biology and geology that are very steeped in time and are all about evolution over time. We might call those the Darwinian sciences. And so there's an interesting snobbishness almost against time. If you are studying something that is not universal, that's idiosyncratic, that's the product of an evolutionary pathway, that's in some ways less prestigious in a sense. So science too, I think, is culpable for this time denial. And even geology, as I suggested before, I think is at fault because we've always had to be looking over our shoulder and keeping track of the young earthers and the creationists. We've flogged people over the head again and again with this idea that the earth is old, geologic change is slow, stop talking about Noah's flood. And maybe we've been too successful because now we're trying to convince people that, in fact, climate change can happen in our lifetimes. And that's a really different narrative. So I think geology needs to look closely at the way it's been depicting itself and the way the Earth system works. And also probably most people have at some point encountered that 24-hour clock analogy for geologic time, which I really dislike. It's the idea that if all of geologic time, 4.55 billion years, were a 24-hour span, humans would appear in the last fraction of a second before the clock strikes midnight. And I think that's just, it's literally true, but its emphasis is off because it suggests that we've just appeared out of nowhere. It denies that we have deep evolutionary connections to all other life forms and to the planet itself. It suggests that the world's going to end. It's kind of weirdly apocalyptic what happens after midnight. And it also kind of removes culpability for what we might have done in the last fraction of a second. It diminishes us in ways that are alienating, but also dangerous because it seems to suggest that nothing we could do in that short time matters. So I think we've been, as geoscientists, we have not done a good job of conveying to people in a way that's not alienating where we fit in geologic time. And so again, that's part of what I'm hoping to do in the book, to give people a sense that feeling a connection to deep time is actually something very human. It can be a source of solace and a real feeling of rootedness. So there's so many ways that time denial has arisen, and they're all tangled up with each other, I think, in complicated ways, ranging from the personal to the collective.
Great. So well, maybe let's try and leave time denial behind us for a little bit and think about a more geological approach to time. So you have these lovely lines in the book that are about encouraging us to think like a rock, to think like a mountain. And it would be great if you could describe a bit more about what that looks like. What is a geologic approach to time?
Yeah, I think let me just start answering that by explaining how I got into geology. I, like many students here, again, have not encountered the field in our high schools. And so almost all of us, including me, happened to take a class as a first-year university student. And what attracted me to the field, I was really kind of a science-averse person. I'd never been told that I could do science. But I was actually always really interested in etymologies of words. I love to know where words came from. And what struck me in the first week of this university course that I took just to fulfill a requirement was that geology is actually like the etymology of the whole world. It explains how things came to be. It has huge explanatory power. And that to me is the geologic worldview, looking out at the land and seeing that this is not an arbitrary constellation of hills and valleys. There's a reason behind this. And we can read the landscape as a kind of a text. And an analogy I often use with students is that of a palimpsest text. I'm sure many people know that word. It's used by medievalists to describe a parchment that was inked and then scraped off and then re-inked, but always there's some vestige under the more recent writing of that earlier text. And I think that's a fairly powerful analogy to the way that geologists see landscape. And of course, the further back in time you go, it gets a little bit more difficult to reconstruct, but that idea that everything is constantly being overwritten and will continue to be in the future is the worldview of geology. Again, in this country especially, people too often associate geology with just inert objects. It's collections of rocks or minerals or fossils. But to geologists, those things are not just inert entities. They're not nouns, they're verbs. They record processes. And so those are, of course, the vocabulary we work with, but that by understanding the vocabulary, we can build up narratives and understand process. So that's the geologic worldview, this polytemporal way of seeing, And it's not just about the past, it's also about the future. It's understanding how over time things change. Nothing really is a permanent feature of the surface of the earth. We have some really old rocks, fortunately surviving from almost the earliest days of the planet, but the geography of Earth is constantly changing. And I think it's really remarkable that in 2 centuries, we've been able to retrieve as much of that geologic story as we have. That, to me, the geologic timescale and the whole understanding of the geologic past is one of the great intellectual achievements of humankind. That we've been able in such detail to reconstruct that is astonishing. So thinking like a geologist is thinking in multiple time planes and time scales, and holding that simultaneously in your head.
And so for all of us, how do we learn how to do that? So how, to use your language, how as individuals can we be more timeful in our lives?
Mm-hmm. And I don't expect everyone to be enthralled with geology or become a geologist or even take a course, but I think the habit of timefulness can start with even small increments of time travel, learning the human history of the place where you live, looking at the palimpsest nature of the architecture and understanding what that signifies about the people who occupied the same place. And then that can be extended back into natural history, getting to know a little bit about why the contours of the land look the way they do. Certainly these days, it's so easy to find either, just hour-long lectures or online resources that do give people some window into what agents have shaped the landscape around them. An example just from London that I thought of was the Serpentine pond itself is a little vestige of a meander bend of a tributary of the Thames, long gone now, but that survives in some of the place names, like Knightsbridge. There was a bridge over this river that was variously called the Westburn or the Kilburn. And I've heard, maybe one of the audience members can confirm or deny this, that the last bit of that river really is in a pipe in Sloane Square tube station. You can see the river as it is, anyway, in a duct that goes over your head somewhere down in the tube station. So, I mean, that's an example that if you look at that Serpentine pond, why is it shaped that way? It's a meander bend of a river that was once there. And of course, we've engineered it away. But I think just that habit of recognizing that there are other versions of the world that came before ours, and there will be versions that don't include us. When we let ourselves accept that, it can be, initially maybe existentially threatening, but understanding that we're part of this continuum is to me some kind of comfort. There's a logic in the landscape. I'm part of this world now, and it will go on when I'm not here. So I think it doesn't have to be deep geologic time. It's just this sense that time passes and it's okay.
So if there are some of the ways that as individuals we can become more timeful, what would a timeful society look like?
And yes, your project is maybe taking this on more than mine. But in my utopian vision, first of all, people would be from an early age steeped in learning about the earth. I have to believe, as someone who teaches, that education is a big part of it, and that it should start from an early age. I think we need new nursery rhymes about how limestone sequesters carbon dioxide for us while you sleep, baby. I don't know, we need a whole scale re-envisioning of the way we teach young children to be earthlings. But we certainly need a more systematic education system where people really do develop a strong, solid understanding of Earth processes so that they can become educated voters and choose people who make decisions on timescales that are commensurate with the kinds of environmental challenges that we have. That would naturally lead to, I think, a collective sense of humility, a more appropriate understanding of the balance of power between people and the natural world. I know this is perhaps naive, but I do believe that real understanding would lead to a very different set of assumptions. I think more practically, we can begin to look to Earth systems as exemplars of good design. The way that the Earth cycles nutrients is a brilliant template for how we should be designing industrial activities. Everything cycles. There's no such thing as waste in biogeochemical cycles. Nothing lasts forever, but everything is repurposed. So mountain building is balanced over time by erosion. The gases exhaled by volcanoes, as I said, is sequestered at the same rate over time by limestone precipitation. What we need to do, though, is find ways of making incentives for people to build these new kinds of structures, infrastructure that are aligned with the way nature works. I think a timeful society would recognize that technology alone is not going to save us. I think it's probably generally true that the unintended consequences of technologies generally outlast the intended uses of those technologies. That in the end, the things that we thought were going to save us have created all kinds of new problems. Think of plastics and antibiotic resistance. I mean, we need these things, but they've also then gone on to create all kinds of downstream problems because things evolve. And so many of our environmental problems today are rooted in the failure to recognize the power of time to transform and entangle new things with older systems. So we would look inside rather than looking to technology as some kind of deus ex machina that's going to save us. We would say maybe there's something about ourselves that needs changing. And I think ultimately what I'm calling for in the book is a cultural change, which is of course the hardest kind. And I really applaud again the long-term time project in trying to do that as well, both pragmatic and cultural change. We need both at the same time. A timeful society would also recognize that natural systems have inertia. So we might suddenly decide one day to become more enlightened, but many of the problems that have been set in motion already in the 20th century are going to have very long shadows. So we're going to need to stick with these things for a long time also, and start as soon as possible, because problems that were decades and decades in the making are not going to be reversed in a matter of years. So yeah, again, I'm just a geologist. I don't know. And the subtitle of the book, How Thinking Like a Geologist Can Help Save the World, was actually not my idea. That was the publisher. I hope they're not listening. But it can't hurt. But I think ultimately it is a cultural change that we need. There's not going to be a single solution. We just have to be smart about finding ways to work within our economic and political structures to nudge people into working with the earth instead of having a mindset of battle.
Great, thank you, Marcia. We've covered so much ground on many dimensions in the last 30 minutes. I think before we go on to the next part of this session, we asked everyone to bring a stone with them. So if you have a stone with you, can you please hold it up? And Marcia, would you like to do something with us and our stones?
Well, I couldn't just choose one. I have so many here. So the point here is not necessarily to identify your rocks. I wish I could look at all of them, but I think it's just to appreciate that any stone that you pick up has a biography locked inside it somewhere. And even if you can't go any further than that, you can't put a name to the rock or read that story, it's there. And I find comfort in that, knowing that there are entities out there that bear these memories of times that are impossibly distant to us, but there's a record of those times. They're in some tangible sense still with us. And so in teaching geology, I kind of dread having to get students to learn rock and mineral names, but one way of thinking about it is that rocks are like sentences. They're little snatches of prose that have some meaning. Minerals are like the words in those sentences. So most rocks have more than one mineral. And then the minerals are made of elements, and they're like the letters. So if you're learning language, certainly you need to learn the orthography of it. You need to learn the alphabet. You need to learn words, and you need to learn some grammar. And so that's the way I provide some incentive for students to learn basic, maybe a dozen or so rock names and maybe 20 minerals. And those are, if you know that many essential vocabulary words, you can do pretty well in geology. So I encourage people, if they're interested, to just try to develop that working vocabulary. But there are some things you can infer about a stone, even if you don't have any background in rock or mineral identification. Certainly the shape, if you picked up a pebble somewhere, if it's rounded, that tells you this has had some travel. It's come by some agent from somewhere else. Maybe it was tumbled along the bottom of a stream. In this part of the world, we have lots of glacial deposits, and London too. You've got glacial deposits, and you might find quite a wide variety of rocks that have come from quite some distance that aren't local. So if it's rounded and it doesn't have any sharp corners, that probably means it's come some distance to you, and you can kind of respect its journey. The context of where you found a rock is really important too. It's often a big part of being able to tell the story. What was the setting in which it was found? Just like an archaeological find, it's very important to know where you found it. Of course, in urban areas, rocks are moved here and there all over for landscaping purposes, and that can be a little bit difficult. And then you can look at the texture. Does it have any kinds of layers? Is it crystalline or granular? Can you see anything at all without a hand lens? And then if you do know a little bit about mineralogy, you can dive in deeper. But every single pebble does has some little, it's like a page ripped out of a very long manuscript. It's got some kind of story. And I know when I walk along a beach, it can be almost a maddening experience. It's like just hearing little snippets of a radio program or something. All of these stones have just a fragment of a story to tell, and I almost have to consciously ignore them and walk past. So maybe in groups, people can share their beautiful pebbles.
Great, thank you, Marcia. There is a note in the chat from Nessie saying, Marcia, you're not just a geologist, you are also a poet. I think we will all agree with that. So, everyone, it would be wonderful if you have any questions, if you can write them in the chat now. Whilst I'm waiting to see those, Marcia, perhaps you could talk a little bit about how can timefulness help us in moments of crisis?
Well, I think it certainly can. When we look back at the geologic record, the Earth has been through some very large magnitude moments of crisis. And I take some comfort in knowing that the biosphere and the Earth itself are very resilient. So each time we've had mass extinction events, for example, life has rebounded. And so the Earth abides. It will go on. Of course, the sobering fact is that in some cases it's taken millions of years to get back on its feet, but it has rebounded. But another lesson of some of these great environmental crises of the past and the mass extinctions of the past is that these are moments of innovation in the biosphere in particular, that evolution was on one path, and when large numbers of organisms were suddenly not there, new lineages got established. And so maybe that's, I'm not, certainly the COVID crisis is awful, and I'm not saying it's a mass extinction, but it's maybe an inspiration for saying we can redesign the path that we're on. Things that seemed just a few months ago so impossibly large and immutable, the fossil fuel industry perhaps, have been shown to be surprisingly fragile and not necessarily beyond our capacity to change. So this, I'm hopeful that we will come out of this with a resolve to do things differently and better, in the spirit of all of those ancient organisms that recovered after mass extinction events. For a few weeks or a week or so this spring, I think gas prices went negative. And the whole laissez-faire economic system has been shown to be almost less prepared for crisis than a subsistence culture. So I think this is a moment to really reevaluate these fundamental ways we structure our societal, the economic system and the political system. A timeful point of view will make us realize again that we need to get started on environmental issues that aren't going to be solved overnight. That this is the time to start and set in motion things that will play out over the next decades. And I'm hopeful that the brush with mortality that many of us have felt during this time will instill a sense of empathy across all of the various divides that keep us apart, that we fundamentally all share the same constitution, literally, the human frame. And I'm hopeful that that will encourage us all to work more cooperatively. So I'm trying to find a silver lining.
So we've got lots of questions coming in. The first one from Justine is, what does Marcia think about the term Anthropocene? Useful, ? Misleading, ?
Good question. I use it as a shorthand in teaching, certainly, because it's easier to say Anthropocene than the time during which human activities have reached par with natural processes. So yes, I think it's a useful conceptual idea to emphasize how in the last century, maybe especially the last 50 years, we have become agents on par with volcanoes, with river systems, some of the great geologic agents of change, that the rates of our activities match those things. How exactly to define the beginning of the Anthropocene, I'm less interested in. People may be aware, there's a lot of kind of arcane debate going on among geologists. Should it officially be admitted to the geologic timescale? And if so, how do we define it? Generally, boundaries in the geologic timescale are marked by layers in the rock record, or in the case of the end of the Pleistocene, the Ice Age, a layer in the ice record. But so to me, that's less interesting than just having this shorthand phrase that encapsulates the idea that we are changing the Earth in ways that are nearly unprecedented in the geologic record. Of course, we've only been doing that for a short time. I don't think it's a self-aggrandizing thing. Some people have also asked me about that. Isn't that kind of, is it hubris to say that we're as important as tectonics or something? It's certainly not. It's a scarlet A that we carry. It's not something to be proud of. It's just an acknowledgement of the disproportionate effect that we're having on the planet. So I find it a useful shorthand to signify all of that. And I'm not part of the debate about how exactly to define it in a in an academic way.
Great. So there's a question from Anna. I'm really curious about Marcia's view on timefulness and geology in relation to astrophysics and the overall age of the universe. For example, do geologists then look to the history of the universe to gain further perspective on the age of the Earth?
That's a great question. So yeah, there's really a full continuum these days in the sciences, from astrophysics, which has to do with the evolution of the universe and stars, through the formation of our solar system and the evolution of the Earth itself. So for example, much of what we know about the earliest days of the Earth come not from Earth rocks. The Earth doesn't have a record of its first 500 million years. What we know is based largely on meteorites, extraterrestrial rocks, and also rocks from the moon, and a few meteorites that have actually come to us from Mars. So the very early story of Earth is largely not told by rocks native to Earth. And so that whole field really kind of dovetails with astrophysics and cosmochemistry, the understanding of how stars evolve and where all the elements that built the planets came from. So I myself am not involved, for example, with knowing what the proper Hubble constant value would be. That's the way we determine the age of the universe. But we, as geologists, are in conversation with people who study these even deeper time scales of stellar evolution and that sort of thing.
Great. So we've got a question about 7 generations principle. So Lena asks, would you align your concept of timefulness with the indigenous people's principle of 7 generations, which is a philosophy that the decisions we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future?
Oh, absolutely. And I actually mentioned that in my book. I think that's the proper way of framing this. It's a human-centered way of thinking about our responsibility. You can imagine 7 generations would be the time from your great-grandparents to your great-grandchildren. That's not only looking forward, but just to imagine that. You perhaps remember your great-grandparents, and you can imagine or have great-grandchildren. So that's 7 generations. You can hold that in your mind. And if you could then project that into the future, that's a time frame that's a human one. And I think that idea is such a powerful way to, it's not so abstract that our mind just blurs, but it's a tangible way of thinking ahead. And in this country, it's really ironic to me that in the last 10 or 20 years, in many cases, the First Nations tribes have led the way in environmental stewardship in ways that the US government has not, in spite of all of the genocide and the just abhorrent record that the United States has had with the First Nations. They're really showing us the way to save ourselves. These communities are based on small patches of land, and when you know that's where you're going to be for the future, you take better care of it than the frontier mentality of moving to the next place. So yes, timefulness is very consonant with this 7 generations idea. I think it's a human way of framing the idea of timefulness.
Great. And so one more question, which is a question from Dominica, which is that she says, I hear a lot of parallels with semiotic thinking, especially being able to read the landscape as a text, signification, and the context of the land it impacts our cultures. Is that an accidental similarity, or are there known crossovers with biosemiotics and geology? And where's good to start, if so?
Well, I guess, yeah, I am a geologist, not a semiotician, but I see the analogy as very apt. There are narratives embedded everywhere we look. There are stories to be decrypted. And so I've been intentional about using those analogies. Now, whether there's an intellectual tradition in the humanities there, I'm not really sure. it just seems like a very logical way of thinking about these natural objects, that they embody, they are texts, literally. We just have to learn how to speak their language and learn their idiom.
Great. There are more questions, but we are out of time. So it's been such a rich hour. For anyone who hasn't already got it, buy Marcia's book. If you think her talking is beautiful, her writing is also very beautiful. So I really recommend spending some time with this book. Marcia, thank you for being so generous with your time, your insight, your past. I know it's definitely going to change how I look at the world underneath my feet. So I really, really appreciate that.